Hi, this is Pastor Jeff Elliott from Cape May Lutheran Church with our sermon for today, which will be available with the Zoom service tomorrow at 10 a.m., but also now on Facebook and also on the YouTube platform. Our sermon is titled Crazy Farmer Singing Hills, Clapping Trees, and the Surrendered Life. The Garden of Eden is not a description of human geography or of history. The church father Origen knew that much. The Garden of Eden is a description of human psychology, kind of the geography of the human soul. We all have a snake brain, a reptile brain, underneath the rest of our brain. And it tells us to fight, or to flee, or to freeze, depending on the context. But certainly to fight when conflict arises. Now we remember how the snake convinced Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that was at the center of the garden in the second creation story. Right next to that tree of the knowledge of good and evil was the tree of life. But the human caretakers of the garden passed by that tree to eat of the forbidden fruit because they wanted to be like God. The text says, knowing good from evil. In other words, capable of rendering moral judgments. The humans chose judgment over life, moving God out of the center of things and putting themselves there instead. They would now be the judge of all the earth. As the Greeks like to put it, man, anthropos, humans. Man is the measure of all things. We would say today, humans are the measure of all things. They made life less about knowing a gracious God and more about knowing everything else. At least that's the way the Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer thought. And frankly, we can see this even in the way that the writer of the Gospel of Matthew chooses to interpret Jesus' parable of the sower. In his interpretation of the parable, which is part of the text, Matthew pays a lot of attention to the different types of soil. Shallow soil, rocky soil, weed-choked soil, good soil. But Matthew focuses very little on the seed or even on the sower. The story that Jesus tells has the wacky farmer wantonly wasting his seed, broadcasting it, just tossing it out extravagantly over every inch of the soil without regard to whether that soil is good or bad, shallow, rocky, weed-choked, fertile. It doesn't matter. The gracious farmer sows every inch of it. Now, when we focus on the wacky farmer, who is clearly an image of God in this parable, broadcasting grace evenly throughout the whole of creation, this becomes a story about the gracious one, the gracious ground of all being that lies at the heart of all things. But when we focus on the soil, comparing one type of person to another as being more or less receptive, then we turn this parable of grace into a parable of judgment. Instead of a lush, gracious creator heaping good gifts on all equally, we examine our human response to those gifts and make salvation dependent upon our action. Making salvation to something that we earn by being good soil. Not Luther would say is salvation by works. We get into that way of thinking, we miss the joy. We miss the joy. The type of joy we see in fantastical texts like the one in Isaiah 55, which reads to me kind of like a page for the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis that I like to read to my children when they were little. In this text, the mountains and the hills burst into song, and the trees clap their hands. All of creation acts like a mirror, showing us the delight that God's self feels when good things happen to God's people. Israel has gone the wrong way and lost everything, but God has not abandoned her. God has decided to set things right. The prophet, therefore, does not give us the words of judgment for which prophets are normally famous. Doesn't even give us a plan by which to make everything right. No. This prophet simply has God announcing that God will set things right. So often in life, things go wrong, and the snake brain tells us it's time to fight. And we attempt to seize control of things, to set things right, to make things right by the force of our will, by our manipulation. And this usually ends up digging the hole even deeper. What we normally need to do in these times and in these situations is the opposite of what our instincts tell us. We normally need to just let go and surrender to the flow of things, trusting that God has a better plan for us than we could ever imagine. I know it's hard to give up control. It's hard to be patient. It's hard to wait on God, confident that God will give victory in the end. We as Americans don't do patience very well. It's probably our biggest weakness. But when we give up control, we discover that God has already sown more grace into our situation than we could ever have imagined. Grace that will help us to surely continue, but grace that we will always miss until we finally surrender our lives to God. Amen.